Dear colleagues, like the semester, the presentations on policy cycle are coming to an end too. In the cyclic, accountable and transparent process of policymaking, termination occupies a major agnet plate because it leads to a new agenda and to possible new beginnings. It also answers the need for creative positive strategies for implementation. First, let's talk about what policy evaluation is.
Policy evaluation is an analytical tool and procedure meant to investigate a policy program for either the implementation process or the actual results. The history of policy evaluation can be characterized into four waves. The 60s saw the emergence of the scientific wave, which entailed the academics and not stakeholders should evaluate through two-group experimentation. Soon after, the dialogical wave slowly rose to popularity. Instead of being scientific, critics said that information in evaluation should be gathered from stakeholders through discussions. In the late 70s, the new public management model redefined evaluation, and it became part of every government policies to establish accountability, value for money, and customer satisfaction. In recent times, a return to the scientific wave through the evidence-based wave happened. The focus returned to scientific approach like randomized controlled trial experimentation. There are three different types of evaluation depending on its functions and timing. The first is the ex ante evaluation, which precedes the decision making to pre-assess the effects of planned policies and to inform upcoming or ongoing decision making processes. The second is called ongoing evaluation or monitoring. It aims to identify the interim results of policy programs to adapt the implementation. The last is the ex post evaluation, which refers to the classical variant of evaluation aimed at assessing the goal attainment and effects of policy programs once they have been completed.
Policy evaluation can be internal or external. It is internal or self-evaluation when it is carried out in-house by the operating agency. Executives and other legislative bodies within an organization also do their own evaluation. In contrast, external evaluation is initiated and funded by outside sources that are typically contracted by an agency outside the operating administrative unit. External evaluation can also be done by experts, where major policy experts, NGO, academics, and various policy institutions evaluate the policy in detail using statistical methods. Media is also one of the major pillars of policy evaluation. Policy evaluation is highly controversial and faces some challenges too. First, problems are sometimes vaguely defined. For example, the government is planning to implement a basic income transfer policy in which basic survival money goes to the poorest bank account. Here, it's hard to discern if this policy will be implemented to eradicate poverty and empower people, or if it's about giving equal opportunities to bring people out of poverty. Another challenge in analyzing the policy after the implementation is the difficulty in identifying what problem the policy was tackling and finding a single goal in the policy. There is also the challenge of lack of information and data. Some projects begin with no evaluating component. If evaluation is later requested, data collection becomes a complicated affair. Politics, bias, and partisanship are the biggest emerging challenges in the policy evaluation. Most often, evaluating organizations don't want to disappoint their subjects, so the evaluation is packaged to favor the organization. Also, any policy evaluation endeavors is not a politically neutral activity because it always entails discussion on successes and failure, which also involves some sort of political statements.
Policy termination is the final stage of the policy cycle. Though this seems to be the logical end of any government program, policy, or institution that accomplishes goals, policy termination is a rather rare phenomenon. What usually happens is that policies, programs, and institutions tend to be redefined, renewed, or even expanded when they seem to be ready for termination. Not all policies are equally resistant. Programs are more susceptible to termination than functions, but it's still hard to see. We can identify several reasons that make termination so difficult. Each point generates a new layer of complexity, stacking up economic, political, social, and administrative and legal burdens. The first factor is institutional permanence. Organizations are characterized by stability. They protect themselves through external and internal factors that defend the policy from radical change, such as political coalitions, legal barriers, and public support to the policy. Dynamic conservatism is the second factor. Here, organizations introduce cosmetic changes in order to look dynamic and resist termination pressure. These changes include increasing their beneficiaries base, broadening their objectives, and including new programs. The next one is anti-termination coalitions. Organizations that they develop create coalitions with stakeholders such as the staff, constituents that support the program of the institution, direct beneficiaries of said programs, and much more. Their power contests maintain organizational equilibrium and makes termination an uphill walk. Next is secrecy, reputation, and intellectual reluctance. Hyper-specialized organizations like medical and defense institutions profit from the knowledge gap between them and the government and constituents. Since these institutions are experts on the area, sponsors have a really hard time countering their statements and therefore promoting termination. Also, unless the organizations or policies have a sunset clause, the legal obstacle of terminating a policy are also quite large. The last factor are high startup costs. Things such as creating a new institution, recruiting and training the staff, designing and starting the policies, and dismantling the former institution or its functions are all economic costs the government will have to take into account. These variables show why it's so hard to terminate a policy, but this doesn't mean that programs and institutions are invulnerable to termination. There are both strategies and conditions that overcome these obstacles.
Policy termination is a hard undertaking, but is not essentially an impossible task. It is amenable to windows of opportunity that could manifest itself in unexpected shifts in the ideological matrix, national mood, and the emergence of a new political leadership. Windows can be predictable when finite limits in space and time are factored into the termination process. It can be induced when the media are co-opted into explaining new perspectives or exposing the harmful aspects of a policy. Windows do not stay open for long, but when they do, a lot can be achieved within a short period of time. There are useful tips and strategies on how to effectively terminate an errant policy. Some of these tips can help facilitate the termination process. First is setting up automatic termination mechanisms. Building automatic termination mechanisms into programs and anticipating termination at the earliest stages of policy design is an example of an induced termination opportunity window built into initial design, allowing for a less painful termination implementation process. Floating a trial balloon. The trial balloon is a valuable political tactic for testing what political wind will buffet a new policy idea. The goal is to generate public discussion, but it will produce no real test. The results are predestined. Those who benefit from the policy and those ideologically committed to it will complain. This constituency is well organized. It can and will quickly mobilize opposition. Third is enlarging the policy's constituency. Termination proponents should seek support from those with specific concerns about the policies targeted for termination. Broadening the policy's constituency and enlarging the political arena in which the policy's fate is debated can most directly alter the balance of influence upon those who will make the termination continuation decision. Next is focusing the attention on the policy's harm. The best way to attract constituents who will vigorously support termination is to focus attention on actual harm caused by the policy. The fifth is to inhibit compromise. Political leaders dedicated to a policy will invariably make those compromises necessary to ensure its continuation. If compromise is somehow precluded, the supporters of a policy are denied one of the basic tactics of survival, and the terminators can gain a significant advantage. The next tip is to buy off the beneficiary. Complete appeasement will not be possible, but some form of severance payment may mitigate the consequences of termination. And the last is to recruit an outsider. The termination coalition needs political leadership or a terminator to dramatize the policy's harm and to manage the administrative details. Consequently, The ideal candidate to implement the termination is an outsider who intends to leave the agency in the future.
As we have seen, the last stages of the cycle show how complex the policy process can be. Policymaking as a discipline is not a straightforward science, but a result of studying the complexities of society. During the evaluation and termination periods, political, economic, social, and legal factors merge and make these final steps particularly hard to manage for policymakers, and this is a reality any policy analyst needs to bear with.